Yes, so today we are going to look at IT risk management, or to be specific, information risk management. But as we go through this lecture, go through this talk, you will find that information security risk management is not a separate part, as in general. When we talk about IT risk management, they complement each other. In fact, they do look, the InfoSec risk management do look like a part of IT risk management, but the InfoSec risk management is very closely embedded into IT risk management. Sometimes, we can actually use the term IT risk management directly for information security risk management. Today also we'll look at threat management, what threats are, vulnerabilities, all those things we'll define and understand, and what risks they pose, or a threat or a vulnerability, what risks are associated with them, and how we're gonna manage. Right. So to start with, here's this quote from Bruce Steiner book, Secret and Lies. All right. It says, if you think technology can solve your security problems, then either you don't understand the problems or you don't understand the technology. So what does it essentially means is, information security is basically risk management. You have to identify risks, and that comes from threats, vulnerabilities, all those things, and you manage those risks. That's basically information security. So information security is all about risk management, right? It is far more effective to think security as an ongoing process of risk management that includes not just protection, but also detection and reaction mechanisms. Now, detection and reaction mechanism is not something we will cover today in today's talk. We will cover definitely those things in subsequent lectures. For example, if there is an incident happen, if a data breach is detected, how organization should respond, or how as an responsible person in organization you should respond, or we all should respond. Those things we'll look at in later classes. However, today we are going to do a risk management. The first line here in this code, as you can see, technology, right? So last 2 weeks you were looking at technologies, right? We looked at cryptography, which is a means to protect CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and to some extent, availability as well. Some of the tools, in two labs, whatever tools we could use or learn or know about, we did in a couple of labs, right? So those are technology. Now, if we actually think that technology alone will solve the security problems, it's kind of half truth, if I may say, right? First, we need to understand what the problem is, isn't it? Then only technology comes into the picture. When we say how to solve it, then, right? First, for that, we need to understand the problems. So the problems and technology go hand by hand. We need to understand problems. We need to understand problems by problems. Here, I mean risks. What are the risks? What could go wrong? First, if you don't, we can't understand. If we don't think like that, what could go wrong? We'll never have, proper plan or proper mitigation plan, or proper technology to use that, to put in a place that that could solve that problem, right? First, we need to understand what could go wrong. So that's basically risk, and that's a proper way to manage risk is basically a risk management, roughly saying. Right. In New Zealand, we have this guidance. It used to be like, proper information security guidance. They used to give that. A few years ago, I used to, when I browsed the websites, um, I used to find that. The organization responsible for doing that is NCSC, which is New Zealand Cybersecurity Center, I guess. This abbreviation. And however, in recent years, like a couple of years, when I was looking at, let's say, yesterday, they have given a guidance where the overall meaning of that guidance is we should look at risk management as a holistic approach, not separating infosec only. Although a security guy, a cyber security guy like us or info security guy like us will be concentrating on only security or cyber security, right? Information security. But risk management, as it says, you can go through and you will find a lot of other documents there in the website. If you browse, I've just given this point to this poster, if I may say, holistic risk management. The idea here is you have to manage risks in wholesome, not only information security, but everything else related. And information security will become a part of that anyway. So risks should be managed as an wholesome, is what the New Zealand, basically the government guidance is. You can go through those all to find out the website. You can go and find out other documents which they have provided. Here, the other one, the other link you see is from UK, as you can see, and NCSC, National Cyber Security Center. They have it's of UK. This particular a basic risk assessment and management method. I have put this link here because we are the lab exercise we are going to do is based on this. Yeah, so you can, if you want to read more after doing lab or before doing lab, here's the link. And the overall risk management guidance for UK, I could find this link. It's pretty much same, right? If it is UK or New Zealand, it won't be much different because a cybersecurity risk is pretty much similar for UK or New Zealand or any other country. They have this a well written, I saw risk management guidance, which again, if you want to further study, can go through this and find out. So with risk, right, everyone manages risk, either knowingly or unknowingly, right? The management of risk is an inherent and often intuitive part of a human nature. Sometimes we do intentionally, sometimes probably we don't do intentionally, but we are managing risks from morning to evening every time in our day life, right? So if you come to Weltec or anywhere, you go to, and when you park, you double check sometimes. I frequently check. I have this habit, but you double check if you have locked your car or not, right? So what are you doing? There is a risk, right? Or someone can take your car away, right? So we lock that car. We lock and we check as well if it is properly locked or not. So we know what was the risk. What are the risks on parking a car in a public parking, for example, right? And whatever control that mitigation mechanism or prevention mechanism we have, like locking, and double checking the lock put in place, we do that. We don't think that we are we are doing this, but unknowingly it's kind of intuitive and inherent part, right? The other point is not everyone will agree on a particular risk, right? Everyone has a perspective as to what they consider risky and what they consider not, right? Even though not everyone agree on the likelihood and impact of the risk or manage it on a equal terms. So it could vary in some cases. In many cases, though, the risk could vary. Someone feel that this is risky. Someone say, no, there is no risk on it. The other disagreement could be impact of that. Someone think that, oh, this is very risky. The impact of the consequences, if this happens, then it's big. Some would say, no, it may not be big. So there could be some of this kind of disagreement, but that doesn't mean that there is no risk and it should not be managed properly. Now, There are, on the other hand, there are well understood risks. For example, personal risks. I just give you an example of a car park, right? Which are well understood, and everybody tends to agree that these are risky, and we should put up a plan, or we should put up a plan to mitigate that risk or prevent something, prevent the consequences that might happen if the risk occurs somewhere, right? The impact of risk occurs somewhere. So management of well understood risk tends to become instinctive and habitual, which we everyone do. Now, what is the purpose of risk management? Right? In our case, we are talking about organization as a whole. I know the guidance, New Zealand guidance says we should have a holistic um, approach for risk management rather than just concentrating on information security risk. Right? And then I started saying, quoting Bruce Schneider, quote that information security is basically a risk management. So saying holistic approach, so basically you are managing IT risk as a whole, and by doing that you will manage the infosec risk knowingly or unknowingly in between that, because they are embedded anyway. Right? So the purpose of risk management is, for an organization, it could be, it is, not it could be, it is ensuring overall business and business assets are safe. So if business has asset, organization has asset. Now the point here is to how to keep that safe, right? That is the purpose of risk management. The other purpose protects against competitive advantage. Now you have organizations, right? And they have competitors. You have organizations doing same thing in a market, IT organization, and there is competition between them, right? So those also protect against the competitive disadvantage. If a competition gives any kind of disadvantage, if something bad happens to you, obviously you as in your organization, obviously the other competitor will get benefit or advantage. So if properly managed risk, if risk management is put on place, proper risk management, then you may not have that disadvantage, right? Also, to comply with laws and best business practices. So best business practices are probably well defined, depends upon what kind of organization, what kind of office it is. Also laws from government, right? So if we have put on risk management process, proper management process, and we follow that, then we are complying with laws as well. Finally, maintain a good public reputation. If something goes bad in your organization, right, the reputation gets hit, right? These days are news, even something happened or not, doesn't matter. Or fake news can hamper your reputation. By your, I always mean your organization reputation, right? So if that happens, what are the plans? What are the procedures put on place to mitigate that effect if something happens, or just prevent or prevent happening any bad consequences, right? So that's also a goal of risk management, so that we maintain, the organization maintains good public reputation as well, relations and reputation. Now, if we like to define, although many people would like to define risk or risk management differently, one of the definitions is a process aimed at achieving an optimal balance between realizing opportunities for gain and minimizing vulnerabilities and loss, right? A process to ensure that the impact of threats exploiting vulnerabilities is within acceptable limits at an acceptable cost. Now, the fact is that we cannot mitigate all the risks. There will always be some risks left, right? We call it residual risks. So you start analyzing what could be risky in your organization. You have hundreds of things. Now you can't put countermeasures. You can't put policies and and procedures for to minimize all the risk. So what we do is to prevent or to prevent or to minimize impact of those weaknesses, which is giving rise to those risks, at a acceptable limit. So up to this, we can accept. These things are risky. Okay, 80% we have solved, 20% we'll accept. Now, exploiting vulnerabilities, that is exploiting weaknesses within the organization process or whatever we do, whatever the organization does. Also, within business organization, we need to take care of cost as well. So putting countermeasure against any threat would cost you money. Is that money you justified? In some cases, do you have that kind of money as well? Right? Goal. So goal would be to identify potential problems before they occur. That's risk, right? Risk is, okay, we are doing something that this might occur, and we put plans and procedures to mitigate the impact of that risk, right? To identify potential before they occur, so that risk handling activities may be planned and invoked as needed across the life of product or project to mitigate adverse impacts on achieving objectives. So that's the goal. As I said, I'm repeating, you can't kind of get rid of all the risks, all the threats. So what are the threats which are important? Prioritize those threats, prioritize those risks, and put a plan to mitigate impact of that. Again, 100% impact, we can't mitigate in some cases, in many cases. And how much cost it will take to put any control measure against a threat, against a risk, right? Is that acceptable for an organization? So those things. Now, if you see this painting actually is a copy of Allegory of Fire by Jan Bruegel. They are, I'm bad with names, so please excuse me for that. So if you see this picture carefully, this famous painting, actually, painting carefully, you see there's a fire here, right? Which is burning a house into ashes, right? And the same fire, not the same, but the fire is also used by other people to light as a source of energy, right? So the same analogy, if I may say, applies to risks. A risk, if properly managed, can turn into an opportunity as well, right? The same fire here is burning house into ashes, but fire can be used, and they can use it for, doing many things. See, they are making some apparatus, some equipment, and they need some fire heated so that iron can be melted and whatever, right? And obviously for lights, in earlier days, we used to use fire, some sort of fire to lighten up the room or whatever, wherever we live. So same fire can be destructive, can be used in a useful way as well. It's same with the risk, right? If we properly manage all risks, it's actually an opportunity we can gain out of a risk rather than potential loss, right? The risk management, the process of ensuring that the impact of threats exploiting vulnerabilities is within the acceptable limits and cost, right? At a high level, this is accomplished by balancing exposure to risk against the cost of mitigation, and all these things we'll see in previous our subsequent slides, against the cost of mitigation and implementing appropriate countermeasures and control, right? So basically, it's a balancing act, right? Balancing between the impact or balancing exposure to risks against cost of mitigation, so impact of risks, if impact of threats, whatever consequences it might have, and if we want to mitigate it, or if we want to get rid of the entire impact, what cost it will, how much it will cost, can we afford that? So balancing these things, balancing these two things is basically risk management, right? It's balancing between realizing opportunities for gain and minimizing vulnerabilities or loss that is caused by risk. Also, to ensure impact of threats are within acceptable limits and at acceptable costs. Now, threats, what are threats? Threat actors or threat vectors? Let me give you an analogy, right? So we all go to crowded places, right? It doesn't happen here in New Zealand, but in Italy or in some part of the world, this is becoming quite common. So if you go to crowded places, there might be several pickpocketers, right? And they are looking for some vulnerable person or vulnerable person or whatever, and they can carry out their act. That's pickpocketing. Now, in this case, for you, if you are in a situation or crowded place, for you, the pickpocketer is a threat, right? Or you can lose your money or wallet, whatever, right? Is a threat. Now, pickpocketer is a threat actor, right? The threat is that you can lose something. That's a risk. Now, pickpocketer is a threat actor, right? The technique pickpocketer might use to steal wallet or whatever from you or snatch a gold chain, for example. If you have a gold chain, is threat vectors, right? The technique or mechanism he will use to actually accomplish what he wants to do is a threat vector. Yeah, the threat actor for you is the pickpocketer. Threat is that something that he might be able to steal something from you, and threat threat vector is the techniques used by threat actor. In our context, info security or cyber security, typical threat actors are insiders. There are some of them insiders, right? Insider as in people who are working inside the organization or company, right? They can do something wrong deliberately or by gross incompetence or by simple error unknowingly, right? But there is a risk that something will go wrong, and depending on what went wrong, the impact could be small, big, all these things to be. So basically, as I said right at the start, what could go wrong? We need to find out what could go wrong and put a countermeasure to that, to sometimes to totally get rid of the impact or the consequences it may have, or sometimes minimize to the acceptable level, right? So insiders could be angry with their boss, or something in the organization, and they can act intentionally or deliberately, and they can try and cause an organization to loss, or by simple error, or by they don't know how to do it, but they're trying to do it and something happened, right? Outside individuals or groups, so either planned or opportunistic discovering a vulnerability. So outside people will find what are the weaknesses if they find out, right? um, or they find by accident that this is the weaknesses and we can exploit that weakness. So threat actor could be outside individuals, right? Could be formal entities that are non-political, such as business competitors or cyber criminals. So if two organizations are competing for example, same tender, let's say there's a government tender with worth millions of dollars, and you both organizations are competing for that tender, and that in that process, some organization may do this is unethical, but may do unethical activities which will impact the other organization. Formal entities that are political, such as terrorists or nation states or hacktivists, they can be threat actor as well in our case, right? Intelligence or information gatherers could be any one of above, like insiders, outsiders, or entities which are political or non-political, right? To gather intelligence about how things are done within an organization or a group of organization, right? Just to gather information, they are also threat, because if they find some information which has some information or some vulnerability, some weakness within procedures, process of an organization, they later, they can exploit it. Someone else can exploit it if the information is put out on public. Technology such as free running bots, and these days particularly AI, um, which could be a part of any of the above, as in all of these threat actors, right? Threats actors are viewed as active, either active or passive, right? So most listed here, these are basically active threats, mostly on previous slide, engage in active efforts. So they are active threats or active threat actors, right? With the goal of compromising the integrity and or availability of their target. Now, those who limit themselves to gathering information, compromising just the confidentiality of their target, are considered passive. So confidentiality, threat to confidentiality, generally threat actor which carries out something to do compromise confidentiality are passive, considered passive. All other threat actors generally are active threat actors, right? In some cases, however, if gathering that information is used to support any of the other actors, insider or outsider, political, non-political, it is classified as an active effort at reconnaissance, right? So the threat actors, we say, right, typically use one or more of the following routes or vectors by exploiting a weakness or vulnerability. Sometimes these are called attack surface. So in information security, what could be a cyber security? What could be these attack vectors are, right? Which a threat actor can exploit or use, right? So vulnerability could be insufficiently protected networks. So you have a computer network within an organization which connects to public, and we don't have a proper firewall, for example, or proper mechanisms to do access control, right? It is not protected properly. Or insufficiently secured endpoints, both fixed or mobile, right? Could be poorly designed or insufficiently protected web applications. So at the application security class, in subsequent weeks, we'll look at some of the web applications. They are not secure because there's no countermeasure for any risks, right? We'll see that. Insufficiently trained or disciplined or disciplined users, ill-disciplined, I should say, privileged or unprivileged, you know, they are not trained. Users are not trained. They might leave their password somewhere, either by intentional or unintentionally, by knowing or not knowing. They are not educated in cybersecurity things. Those are the attack. One could be an attack surface. People can, a threat actor can use those techniques, find out information because of insufficiently trained or ill-disciplined users. Email to insufficiently trained users and or insufficiently screened accounts. Accounts are not vetted properly, doesn't have a proper security policy applied to any of those accounts. Insufficient authentication or compromised credential for entry into remote access protocols, right? This could be attack vectors. Now, vulnerabilities, right? Let's go back to the pickpocket analogy we were talking about. Excuse me. So, a, 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 you know, a threat actor a pickpocketer in that case, right, could choose someone as target, and they might not choose someone else as a target. So, in a crowd, there are a lot of people, but they could they could choose a specific target. Why? In threat actor's view, right, that particular person could be more vulnerable than others, right? Now, if you know that you are more vulnerable than others, you will put things on place, or you have weakness. Vulnerability is basically weakness. Some weaknesses that a threat actor, in this case, a pickpocketer, could exploit. Right? If we know those weaknesses, we can get rid of those weaknesses or put countermeasures to prevent minimal impact. Right? Similarly, vulnerability in information security is weaknesses. Some patches, some faults, some data things which a threat actor can exploit, right? Therefore, we need to have a proper vulnerability management as well, right? Vulnerability in technology, in our case, are sometimes known as flaws, right? There are a couple of um, databases which has listed vulnerabilities, so common vulnerabilities and exploits. If something is detected, usually people go there and submit their flaws and vulnerabilities. You can go and look at, for example, here you can see in Microsoft Exchange remote, Microsoft Exchange Server remote code execution vulnerability. You had the security vulnerability, attack vector was network. You can go and see, there is scoring system as well. CVE has a scoring system which gives points to these vulnerabilities based on how likely it could occur and what could be the impact of the vulnerability if exploited, that is, right? And there's common weaknesses enumeration or CWE database, again, CWE-MyTrade.org. It also lists all the vulnerabilities, known weaknesses of any system. So if something is wrong, something someone has detected, they go and put there. There are hundreds of thousands of weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So as an InfoSec professional, it's always good to go through those databases and find out vulnerabilities, particularly for your product, or those vulnerabilities which could directly apply for your organization or the job you do, and put countermeasures against that. Right? So now let's discuss what is risk. We're talking about risk management so far. Now let's formally discuss what is risk. Right? So risk is the possibility of suffering loss, or as we looked at that painting with that fire, right? Fire can be destructive, but if properly used, fire can be constructive as well, which we have been using from so long, right? So risk is a possibility of suffering loss, or if properly managed, gaining opportunities as well, right? If loss, it is the potential future harm that might occur due to some present action. That's right. So if something bad goes, if something really goes bad, then what could go wrong? How much the harm could be? Those things, right? So to measure that, we have three things. Generally speaking, three things. Probability. Probability is it's a measure of likelihood that threat will occur. So there is a threat, we know, but how likely it could occur? Is it likely that it would occur? Right? Impact, if indeed that happens. Right? It's a measure of the loss that occur when threat is realized. If indeed it happened, what could be the loss? What could be the impact? The third thing, risk exposure. Now it helps to measure the magnitude of a risk, right? The likelihood of a threat agent systematically exploiting vulnerability of a system of people, could be process or technology, right? That's the likelihood. The potential impact of a successful attack on an organization information operation, which is basically now we're trying to see this total risk is threats times vulnerability and times asset value, right? As I said, we cannot get rid of all the risk. The whole idea of risk management is to bring it down to the acceptable level in terms of impact as well as in terms of the cost to put countermeasure against those risks, right? So you have residual risks, which is basically total risks minus countermeasure and safeguards. So there will always be residual risk. Risk is an inherent part of business. We're talking about it's the management is inherent part of human nature, but risk is also risk management is inherent part of human nature, but risk is also inherent part of business, right? All risk cannot be eliminated, as we say, right? Every organization has a level of risk that it will accept, or sometimes it has to accept. That's called risk appetite. Now, it could be low risk. Organization can have a low risk appetite or high risk appetite, right? For example, a bank, a financial institution, a bank could have low risk appetite. They can't take risks. They can't have a big residual risk because because of the finance involved, personal data, customers' data and customers' money and everything. However, similar financial education institution, like for example, investment company, could take a bit more of risk. They can invest their money in many other startup vendors, which they also know that some of them will fail. All startups do not, get get into a successful company. Some of them always fail, but the financial investment company actually invests into them, right? Taking some risk. So they have a little bit of high risk appetite than a bank, for example. They have low risk appetite, right? It also depends what kind of risk and what kind of organization we have. To determine the reasonable level of acceptable risk, right? We usually, or the risk management usually determines an optimal point where cost of loss intersects cost of mitigation. Would have high risk, low risk, right? Now, we need to, as an organization or risk manager, you need to think of mitigation. What will be the cost of mitigation, and where does it meet the loss of impact, the impact of risk, right? We'll see that in a while. So the first part of risk management, if I may say, is identification of risks, right? The first step is to generate a comprehensive list of threat sources, risks, and events that might impact the achievement of each of the objectives. Now, right? So to identify it in a comprehensive way, right? Risk can be related to or characterized by following: origin, which is basically activity, event, or incident related risk; consequences by consequences, right? Specific reason for occurrence, right? By protective mechanism and controls, and time and place of occurrence, right? Each of these in a technique we'll see now. There are approaches. There are different approaches in literature. The book I have listed, a couple of books also define all of these approaches. Recommended books, if you see, you can go to our e-library and find all those books for free if you want to read a chapter or a full book from there. So most of these risk approaches are based on held on common risks and issues or risk modeling tools such as the following. There is OWASP Top 10, which is Open Web Application Security Project, Top 10 Security Risks. So these are published every 10 years, sorry, every 4 years, I guess. And if you go, right, if we go through, for example, new top 10 is supposed to come out this year, right? Yeah, when you need it, suddenly our fiber becomes slow. But that's so you can see. So these are right. So 2017 we had, and then 2021 they just list top 10 risks in our in information security context. Obviously, you can see the latest one, which was done in 2021. Now in 2025, after 4 years, right, we'll get another top 10 based on data collected all over the world, right? So you have broken access control, cryptographic failures, injection securities, and these are infosec risks, you can say, or application security risk. Top 10. There could be hundreds of them, but top 10, right? So these approaches we were talking about, uh, these risk approaches or risk management approaches are based on some of these data. Yeah, right. Risk and issue based, right? Done. This a system called PASTA, Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. Now these are all frameworks which I'm going to list a few slides. You can always Google and find out within a class. We can't go through all these frameworks, which actually it would be good if you just take one and find out and go through that framework, right? Other approaches are attack trace to find out identification, that is identification of risk, right? To find out what are the risks, attack trace and attack based approaches. This is one of the legacy approach, if I may say, or oldest approach to protecting cyber assets. Originally, it was singularly applied. However, over the years, it has been found to be most effective when used with combination with one or both of the following system for scoring vulnerabilities and weaknesses of data sources. Again, those two databases we just mentioned, the CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and CWE, Common Weaknesses Enumeration, right? And they list weaknesses which are found, common weakness, that is common, and they give a score. Similarly here, they list common vulnerability which have been found in any software, network related or operating system related, whatever, cybersecurity related, right? Any asset, and they list those vulnerability. They also suggest patches and everything, but they list vulnerability and they give score. Now, based on the score, you can actually, what you can do within an organization, you can draw a tree. Again, this is an approach, right? If you go into detail, we can find more, but they draw a tree which is known as attack tree, right? So, for example, right, in the a simple, right, what is the how there are how many ways you could compromise your email? So you have an email, right? You are reading how many different ways other person. So by compromising, in this case, would be other person can have access to your email. Now, in a tree, let's make root as a reading an email or compromising an email, like a root, right? And then this tree has branches, right? So how many ways you can think that someone can compromise others' email or read others' email? One could be by stealing their password. The other way could be like other tree, or the branch of that tree could be just looking behind when you are reading your email. I just come and stand like I do in labs, but I don't read your emails, to be honest, right? When you're working, I sometimes come behind and look at your screen. So by looking at screen, third way could be um, by sending some phishing email, which you click and you get username, password, whatever, right? Third. Now, for the first way, which is stealing password, how many different ways you can, what are the techniques, how many different ways you can apply to steal a password of someone's email password? Then you list that particular node will have 3 or 4 more branches. You list all of them, how you can steal password, right? By threatening, by bribing, or just looking at when they're typing, all those things, these 3 things, right? Now, for each of those things, you would then put some cost, right? What technique they could use, what is the expertise level to steal a password. For example, for bribing, what will be the cost? Or for example, for stealing or just standing behind or putting, installing some key logger. Now I'm randomly putting up a attack tree for reading an email, so reading someone else's email, right? So at the bottom of that tree, you put cost, right? Based on how it could be done, how much it would cost in terms of money as well as expertise, right? So then you would find, I don't have any example attack tree, but then you would find you'll follow one of the branches and see total cost for each branches. Now each of these branches are what? Actually, they are showing you the cost for having that attack, right? If that attack comes, what is the cost? Now you will first like to patch. You would first like to get rid of the most cheapest cost attack, which would require lowest level of expertise, and which will cost the lowest cost, right? And then move up the ladder, and in some of those attacks, some of those branches, which this is the way to attack, in this case reading an email, some of the branches, you could see that it costs too much to go this way. And if you don't have that much money, you will just leave it. You'll accept that, yeah, there is a risk. That's residual risk, and that is basically risk identification and in a further management using attack tree. Yeah, I could have explained in lab. Probably I will draw and explain them, right? As I said, there are a number of different approaches. So Rick's approach is threat-based modeling. Threat-based approaches use threat modeling tools such as Stride. Again, these are framework and tools. So you can just simply Google. If you are interested, we can discuss in lab. There are so many of them. We simply cannot go through everything in a class, in one lecture, that is. Stride, spoofing identities, tampering with data. This is the abbreviation for this thing. We simply call Stride. Repudiation, information disclosure, and denial of service. D for denial of service. E for elevation of privilege. If someone get access to your root or admin access, for example, in OS, what could happen? What are the risks? What could that person do? In fact, this example is very generic. With root access, you basically can do whatever you want. But yeah, dread is another approach. Damage potential, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. Right? Another is vast and so many, right? This quantitative TMM, quantitative threat modeling method, which builds attack trees, we just discussed, based on Stride, right? And then looks the attributes of attacks categorized in tree to identify dependencies between them. It refers to the CVSS to assign scores to components of the attacks, right? You have issue based, you have threat based. Again, Trike is another approach, or we can say framework. This approach looks at the systems users, that is actors, their CRUD, that is creating, reading, updating, and deleting actions. Nothing whether a given action is allowed, disallowed, or needs to have rules applied for their action to occur. The rule tree, that is decision tree, is applied as needed, right? And then they will give you an indication of how risky it is, or if there is a, what is the magnitude of this risk. Now, DFD, again, these are system analysis. In system analysis and design, you may have come up with these kind of diagram, data flow diagram is applied to identify two types of strike threats, denial of service or elevation privilege. Again, if we go through each of those, in fact, in some cases, just learning one of the threat modeling approaches, risk approach, identification, that is, approach will be very good. We will do one very basic in lab. Security cards, PNGs, again, all these things are specifically applied to, it is not generic as such. Like attractories are very generic. It can apply to any kind of problem, any kind of issue, any kind of organization looking at risks. However, some of these are very specific. I think this one, Trike or any other Trike or similar are applied. This kind of risk approach are applied in DevOps, right? The DevOps software development, not software development, but DevOps development operations, where you have multiple source which is deployed in a source one version control system, could be anything, and we have to manage all those things. The DevOps manages all those things, and their risks can be analyzed or identified using one of those approaches. There are privacy-based and hybrid approaches as well. Privacy-based approaches, LINDUN, which is again short form for linkability, identifiability, non-repetition, and so on. Hybrid approaches, STMM, the hybrid threat modeling method combines the following. Two human-based approaches, such as security cards or PNG, that is persona non grata. A requirements-based approach, such as SQUARE, that is security quality requirements engineering method. It's a combination of those, some hybrid approaches, right? There are multi-dimensional approaches as well. There's something called FAIR, of open group pair analysis, information risks. Again, all these approaches I am skimming through just now. You can find in those books or simply Google and find out, right? If you want to go into detail. These approaches looks at asset from, I may say here, risk management again could be a full course, right, in itself. And we can go on all these details of these things, but in one lecture, and tries to determine probability, that is likelihood that a threat actor will succeed, thus resulting in a loss, right? There's something called Octave, Allegro, and simply a Olective come up designed by Carnegie Mellon CMU, that is Software Engineering Institute, back in US, up in US, that is, and they are also one of the popular approaches, which is operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation, right? The control-centric approaches, the RMF or risk management framework. This method is a favorite in United States federal government. Starts by categorizing a given system or technology based on the impact to the agency if said system is compromised, right? Impact is rated only as low, moderate, or high. Effectively, a deterministic single point of quantitative analysis. Systems are classified as minor, major, or part of general support system, or GSS. So just to summarize, right? Now you have organization, right? That is owners of an organization, which will have value. What value? Of assets, right? Owners usually, wish to minimize risk. right? How do we do that? And you can follow one of these link, and everything is connected in a way in this mind map, sort of mind map. Honors impose countermeasures to reduce risk, right? Because countermeasures are that may poses vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities that may be reduced by countermeasures, right? Honors may be aware of vulnerabilities. Now you can put countermeasures that will reduce, right? So everywhere go. Threat agents, on the other hand, right, give rise to threats that exploit vulnerabilities, leading to risk. In our pickpocket analogy, risk was something could be stolen from you, right? Threats that increases risk as well. Risk to what? The assets. Threats to assets basically, and they wish to abuse and or may damage the asset, which is of value to the owner, right? So these are kind of interrelation between threat agent or simply threat, asset, and organization or owners of that threat, as well as putting countermeasures and vulnerabilities. Relationship between threat, vulnerability, and risk, right? So threat agent, you can say threat actor, right? Give rise to threat that will exploit vulnerability, which leads to risk. These are, this is how the flow is and relationship between all these things: threat, vulnerability, and risk. Now, risk can damage asset and causes an exposure, can be countered by a countermeasures. Countermeasures reduces or eliminates in most, reduces definitely in all cases, but eliminates risk or vulnerability. Now, this if it is reduced, this is reduced, asset can be protected from an exposure. And this basically is an ongoing process, right? You have a new threat every time that could exploit a vulnerability, or you have a new vulnerability. Now you have a threat that could, the vulnerability can be exploited. That obviously leads to a risk, and that will have consequences, impact, right, to the asset of an organization, right? We need to put a countermeasure. So it's a continuous process, right? So what is threat agent? To define an entity that may act on vulnerability, or threat actor, right? Threat, which is potential cause of an incident. These are standard definitions, as you see. These are ISO 27002. These are document numbers. You can simply Google and find out these documents. A potential cause of an accident or incident that may result in harm to a system or organization. That's threat. Vulnerability basically is a weakness of an asset or a group of assets that can be exploited by one or more threats. Risk, the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets and thereby causes harm to the organization. Impact, so if someone exploits the vulnerability, right? Impact is the result of information security incident caused by a threat, which affects assets. Exposure, an instance of being compromised by a threat agent. These are simple one-line definitions, right? Countermeasures or safeguard is an administrative, operational, sometimes technical, or logical mitigation against potential risks, right? So now we are going to look at risk assessment methods, right? There are many, but a couple of them which are most used, or most used in practice, are quantitative method and qualitative method, as you can see in this slide, right? And if you remember in the second slide, NZ, titled NZ Guidance, I had put this link of one of the basic risk assessment or management method. Um, uh, there's a guide to that. I must probably, it's better if I go there and show you the link. Here it is. Here we're talking about that, right? And this is, we said based on this, we'll do an exercise, lab exercise as well. So please pay attention. Not that you should not, you should pay attention to every other slide as well. Now, quantitative, quantitative and qualitative, right? In qualitative, you see, you calculate a few factors, right? Based on that, you assess the risk, right? So for example, ALE, right? Annualized lost expenditure, expectance, ALE, which is a product of SLE and ARO. So SLE is single loss expectancy, right? Which is monetary loss impact for each occurrence of a threatened event. Now, if you do lab exercise, you will have more clear understanding of all this. But now, just at a basic definition level, and that gives the product of this SLE and ARO, which is basically annualized rate of occurrence. So how many times in a year it could occur, the frequency which a threat is expected to occur on an annual basis, basically, right? So ARO times SLE, monetary loss or impact for each occurrence of a threatened event, gives ALE, which is annual lost expectancy, right? How do you calculate SLE then? SLE is SF value, AB, SF value times EF, exposure factor, an instance of being exposed to losses from a specific threat, right? So these are the things we calculate in quantitative method to assess the risk. The impact of the risk, first you identify risks, and then calculate and you assess those risks. On the other hand, there's a method qualitative, which basically depends on likelihood, how likely the threat could occur, risk could occur, right? So likelihood determination, which depends upon threat agent motivation and as well as capability, how motivate a threat actor is, an actor which carry out this threat, could carry out this threat, and its capability. As I said in attack tree discussion as well, right? When you calculate cost is in terms of money as well. It's also the capability of a threat actor, how difficult it is to carry out this threat, right? Also, the nature of vulnerability, how easy that can be exploited or how difficult, again, it relates to capability, existence, and effectiveness of control methods as well. So these three things, the control method that is available, existence, and how effective that control method is. So based on this, how likely a threat could occur. That's qualitative, right? Then there's impact analysis. Impact on what? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Remember in the first class when we were talking about information security principles, I said this is basically CIA to protect, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So our whole information security revolves around these three things. Other models did add non-repudiation and authentication as well. But if you look at it, these three things can cover those two principles as well. So impact on system mission, that the process performed by an IT system and data criticality, the system's value or importance to an organization. They are based on the impact analysis based on these three things: system and data security. Now, how do you rate in qualitative method is you have a matrix, we call it risk matrix in general, right? So likelihood level could be low, medium, impact. It's from 1 to 3 rating, right? Magnitude of impact, if this threat happen, if this actually happens, if the impact is significant, which is high, serious if it is moderate, and mild if it is low, right? So likelihood plus impact, the 2-dimension matrix. We, or in qualitative method, we draw like that. How likely this could happen and what impact it could have, right, for a particular threat. And it is rated between in a scale of 1 to 3. So 1 being low and 3 being the high, right? Which is confidential impact. This combination of confidentiality and impact is 3, would mean high, depending on what information type you are looking at. Availability, impact on availability, that is an impact on integrity, right? When we say magnitude of impact, right? Where the acceptable values are values for potential impact are low, medium, and high. So 1, 2, 3. Now, if we compare qualitative and quantitative method, there are few obviously pros and cons. You can see quantitative method assessment and results are based on substantially on an independently objective process and metrics, thus meaningful statistical analysis is supported. So you have the data, you calculate actually data, you have data, and that data can give you meaningful and result, right? All these are numerical numbers. When you calculate, these are numbers, right? Numbers is easy to see and to make decision on. The value of information are expressed in monetary terms with supporting rationale, which is basic, easy, easily or better understood. Thus, the basis of expected loss is better understood here when we assess using quantitative method, right? Which is a credible basis for cost benefit analysis, or CBA, which we are going to see next, of risk mitigation measures is provided. Thus, information security budget decision making is supported because we have figures, of value figures in monetary terms. Downside of quantitative method could be calculations are inherently sometimes complex. If they are not understood or effectively explained, management may mistrust the results, right? As a risk analyzer, if you do this and if it is not properly done, as in the calculations, or so for example, what is the risk of someone getting into, I'm just saying in general, someone getting into our network, right? If our network is not protected by, for example, firewall, properly configured firewall, right? Then it's a high risk. Now, how much that firewall would cost, right? So you can easily find how much that firewall will cost, that equipment cost and, configuration cost. If you don't have a network manager in your office, you can hire someone or give, consultant to, or the firewalls sometimes are, already configured. You just have to tweak a little bit to, depending on your organization needs. You can easily calculate the cost of that, right? But what is difficult is to calculate or put a money value or figure on the impact. If we don't have a firewall, how much loss we could go? Company could shut down, isn't it? If someone gets into and they steal sensitive data of customers, if your company is customer based, then the company could shut down. So the value would be as much as the value of company, or that's the extreme case I'm saying, right? Or what I'm saying here is it's very difficult to put a figure on if someone gets into and steals some information, how much loss will be that how much loss the company could suffer in terms of monetary value. Now, depending on what that firewall will protect, you can calculate a estimated value, right? So that is what we are saying. Management may mistrust if you have put a random value. If you don't have any, idea behind of any different decent rationale behind the value you have put of a potential loss. Potential countermeasure, you can actually calculate. Everyone knows that value, right? So those things are a bit challenging, and that's why it is complex. A substantial amount of information about target information and its IT environment must be gathered here. There is not yet a standard independently develop and maintain threat population and frequency knowledge base. That's another challenge. right? If we have, then we could simply take that knowledge and based on that we can calculation, right? Quantitative calculations are simple and readily understood and executed. In qualitative, they are not necessarily to determine the quantitative threat frequency and impact. Data are also not necessary to estimate the cost of recommended risk mitigation measure or calculate the cost benefit analysis, right? These are general indication. The qualitative assessment method gives you general indication of significant areas of risk that should be addressed, addressed or provided. That should be addressed is provided. I have to correct this one. Downside of qualitative is risk assessment and results are essentially subjective in both process and metrics. Remember, here we said it's likelihood you determine the likelihood, and then you kind of propose an impact. If this happens, what would be the impact? And now we are not measuring in terms of a money. You are simply saying is that very high or medium or low. So basically, you can simply prioritize the higher risks and put countermeasures. Serious, you go next, and low. Sometimes you can simply ignore or you put countermeasures against those risks. So this is easier, isn't it? Is it easier to calculate or to give indication? However, the assessment and are essentially subjective in both process and metrics. Sometimes, when we were having a general risk decision, we said, people may vary. Some people find some risks are there are high risks. Some people may find those risks are not that high. The impact may not be high, or the likelihood is not high. So these are subjective, depending on the group of people doing it. And most will do good job, I'm saying, but there is no measure of a real good qualitative analysis. We can't simply say this is good, this is bad, because these are subjective, right? And no effort is made to develop an objective monetary basis for the value of targeted information. There's no monetary basis which will support decision. If you're saying this is highly likely and this has a high impact, there would be no monetary basis for saying that, right? No basis is provided for CBA, that is cost benefit analysis of risk mitigation measure, only subjective indication of a problem. In fact, no monetary basis at all. Now, it is not impossible to track risk management performance objectively when all measures are subjective. So even having said that all these things, it is not impossible to track the risk management performance objectively when we say, these are high, these are highly likely. Whether that's true or not, it's not impossible to do that. Some of the risk by nature, you will say, this is high risk and it will have a higher impact. It's well kind of understood. Again, this is just in comparison, qualitative and quantitative risk, pros and cons. So you can just go through disadvantage similar to what we just discussed here. Right. So the process, we say methods, right? Risk assessment method. Now process basically is you have input, you do risk assessment activities, and then you have outputs, right? So inputs could be hardware sales, software sales, systems, ifs, data and info, people or mission. Then you prepare for risk assessment, simple categorization, right? And then it will have some output, right? System boundary, function, data criticality, and all those. For example, history of state system attack, that could be input, from where you get data to support your decisions, basically. Data from intelligence agency, US CERT, OIG, and anything. right? Which will identify threats, identify threat sources and events. You can have output as a threat statement. So this could be a threat based on what you got the input, right? You have report from prior task assessments, any audit comments, all those which will help. This is risk assessment activities, identify vulnerabilities, predisposing conditions, list of potential vulnerabilities that actually is giving rise to this threat, right? Or these other words, the threat can exploit these kind of vulnerabilities, right? Then threat source, motivation, threat capacity, nature of vulnerability, current controls will determine likelihood of an occurrence, right? Determine the likelihood of an occurrence. You can output is likelihood rating, medium, high, whatever, right? Medium, high, or low. Then input. You need this kind of information is what I'm saying. Input is this kind of information to do this, this activity, and you will have that result. Is what we are saying here. Yeah. Mission impact analysis, asset critical assessment, data criticality, data sensitivity will help you determine the impact it may have, right? Impact rating, the output is impact rating. You can go and see more about impact rating in this documentation as well. Determine risk after that, right? The likelihood of threat exploitation, magnitude of impact, adequacy of plant or current controls will determine risk. Output is risk and associated risk levels, information protection plan, plan of action, and milestones. So this basically summarizes risk assessment process. What you need to carry out what task and what task should output what, or as a result of carrying that task, what what you will have as an output, right? A simple steps in any risk management plan would be first identify risk, assess risk. Finally, you have you put controls, countermeasures or control safeguards against those risks, right? These steps are similar regardless of context, either it's infosec, physical or financial security or any other. So in general, IT security, right? We are actually, only focused in general as what infosec, right? So looking at components of risk management, you have risk management here and risk control assessment, right? Which will have risk identification, then you analyze those risks, risk prioritization that involves, risk assessment will involve these things. First you identify, then analyze, and then prioritize. High risk, high impact component will be counted first, and so on, right? The other risk is the component is risk control, which will comprise risk management planning, risk resolution, and risk monitoring as well. New things come up. Have we covered those or not? A life cycle, risk management life cycle, you can have, risk, IT or information technology, you can say, risk identification, risk assessment, risk response and mitigation, risk control, monitoring, and reporting. And it's a continuous process. It never resets, never actually stops, right? You keep on because there are new threats, new vulnerabilities that gives rise to new risk. So we keep on doing that. Steps of risk assessment, we saw a couple of risk assessment method, quantitative and qualitative. So risk identification, which basically involves isolating potential risks to the organization. So you identify what are the things which could go wrong. Risk analysis, you would then analyze the types of risk to the organization, and then risk prioritization, right? Place risk in an order of hierarchy. Which one is better? We're just talking about this figure, right? Which one should be which one should be dealt with first? The higher one should be higher impact, higher likelihood should be, in general, should be countered first. But depending on, again, if you don't have cost to mitigate that risk, you'll probably think that, okay, let's go for the next priority, right? Steps of risk controls, risk management planning, creating a plan to deal with potential risks. Again, we are talking about that figure. Risk resolution is putting the planning in a place. You plan in risk, planning, deal with potential risk, and then you put that plan in a place, and you keep monitor, or you continuously monitor, watch over the current risks while looking out for new risks. Risk identification. How do you carry out risk identification? There could be a number of ways, but the steps you might follow is identify your organizational information assets. First, you have to find out what assets you want to protect. What is that you want to protect? Classify and categorize those identified assets into useful groups, right? Some of these things in a notional way you will do in lab. Everything, like whatever we're discussing after that slide, everything a little bit you'll do in a notional way, right? We can't have a bigger exercise, but yeah, whatever exercise you have, all these concepts, you will feel there that you are applying. And then you rank assets based on necessity to the organization, right? To the right is a simplified. This is a simplified example of how a company may identify risk, right? Asset. Bob as a worker, right? Asset type is personal infosec, personnel. He is an employee. Asset function, what does Bob do? Secure networks, pen testing, and make coffee. What is the priority level on Bob as a risk? Maybe low, depending how trustable Bob. And there are many other. It's a subjective, as I said, right? When you say high, low, and those things, this is always subjective. Many other factors. Based on that, you will rate Bob as a risk, low or high. Now you have this blade server, Cisco US, which is basically type classify, categorize, identify based into useful groups, right? Hardware or networking. Function is database server. This blade runs database server, and priority level is high. So it's more risk involved here. If someone gets into, the impact it will be, they can steal all the data, and your company might shut down, right? Customer personally identify information, confidentiality of that data, right? That's the category. Provide all information, business transaction, and it's critical. Windows 10, that's operating system. Employee access to enterprise asset function is enterprise software. So employee use this, and the risk level is medium. So you categorize in a risk identification, right? In assessment, the steps to take risk assessment are identify threats and threat agents. You will prioritize those threats and threat agents and assess vulnerabilities in current InfoSec plan. And then determine the risk of each threat, right? On a scale, you can say 1 to 5 or whatever. So R being risk, right? P being probability of threat attack. We need some data to calculate those things. V, value for information asset. M, mitigation by current controls. Whatever existing controls, can we do that? U is uncertainty of vulnerability. Right? Now, for an example, you can see threat agent, threat actors. Remember, we looked at a few slides ago. Could be insider. So this control insider could steal company information to sell, target asset company data, that is customer AI, and could be many things. Threat level is high. If there is some employee which is disgruntled, right, threat level is high. You have potential exploits, right, or possible exploit, access control credentials, InfoSec knowledge, knowledge of InfoSec's policy of a company and everything. Now you calculate and give risk scale of 1 to 5, 4.16, and similarly fire, although not directly related to information risk. But you see, when we say even New Zealand guidance, we say that in InfoSec risks are closely embedded within IT risks. We should have a holistic or wholesome approach to look at risk. not only InfoSec risk. So fire and burn the facility down. You see, target asset, these things, threat level critical, and mishandle equipment, possible experts. This will have some based on this formula, right? So is HackerBest, and you can find these things. Then risk control, right? We're again looking at this figure, right? Risk identification we have gone through. Risk control, the steps of risk controls are, right? One is CBA, cost benefit analysis, which we saw in quantitative, right? While calculating, so single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, annual rate of occurrence, simply you can say ARO, annual, we calculate these things if we are using the quantitative method. Annual loss expectancy, that is ALE, annual cost of control or safeguard, right? And then the second thing is feasibility analysis, that is organization feasibility, operational feasibility, technical and political feasibility. Are they feasible? Risk control strategy implementation, after we build a strategy, calculating based on all these steps, and then implement. Let's look at something, right? Cost-based analysis. So this is what we are looking at here, right? So based on some calculation, you do, like a method says, SLE, ARO, AV, all those, calculate and find it, right? So determine what risk control strategies are cost effective. Below are some common, these are some common formulas used to calculate CBA. SLE, we just saw before, asset value exposure factor, basically is percentage of asset affected. What is EV? Percentage of asset affected. It is 100%, 20%, whatever. Then you calculate ALE, right? So SLE times ARO. ARO is, we saw, and right? ARO is annual rate of occurrence. Basically, you calculate CBA, which is ALE, without putting control or pre-control, without putting a safeguard, and then after putting safeguard, right? And then annual cost of control. That's basically cost analysis, right? You can have this kind of $3 value, project cost. So you are putting risk analysis, risk assessment, risk analysis, risk management fully. You are doing the risk management. That's your project, operational savings, cash flow you have, and those kind of cost. Again, this will probably be done by a manager, right? Which will make a decision on your plan or on your strategy, right? So risk control strategies. Strategies, you have risk assessment. We looked at qualitative, quantitative method, right? Which gives you results, obviously, and that based on that results, you have risk treatment option. You can actually, you can have 4 of those strategy based on what result you have. You can simply avoid risk, which is called, organization actually takes these 4 approaches. Simply avoid, right? Or risk avoidance, risk transfer. So you transfer to someone else to look after that. For example, buying insurance, all those things we'll see in a minute. You try and reduce the risk and bring it to us acceptable level, or in sometimes you simply retain that risk. You can't do anything about it. All these 4 steps will give you to some risk. Some risk will be left. Simply we say residual risk. You can't mitigate all the risk. All these approach will have some residual, right? The decision here is, now, is this risk acceptable, the residual risk acceptable? Yes, go risk acceptance. No, again, do risk assessment in some different way. Try and find, solution. Assess the results, again, do one of those, right? So balancing, which is in CBA, balancing cost and risk, right? You can see, this is again a very difficult decision, but one of the way one can do is, you see, you have cost and then security, right? Security, when you apply security infosec, that is, you'll have cost. Now you will have to find some figure like that, some intersection like that, cost and risk balance, a sweet spot. You would like to be here. Most organizations follow these strategies, right? High risk will have high cost, obviously, right? I mean, getting rid of all risk will have. So if you have low risk here, cost is high, right? Um, if you have highest risk, obviously, if you don't get rid of anything, you will have low cost, isn't it? But what we need is this intersection point where, so putting this much of money, for example, putting $100,000 and doing this will give us, will get rid of 9 of these risks, for example, 9 of these threats. So we are protected against these threats, but there are some which we can't do, right? Based on how much money you have, you need to find this intersection, cost and risk balance. Risk control strategy, avoidance, right? We're talking about this. What was that? Yeah, this treatment option or control strategies, risk avoidance. Now, the first one is just avoid, right? So risk avoidance is basically decision not to be involved in or action to withdraw from a risk situation. You simply don't want to accept it, right? You just simply want to avoid, right? Which is not a good thing to do, but in some cases it happens. You can't do anything about it. People don't care simply. Another strategy, transfer. So it's basically sharing with another party the burden of loss or benefit of gain for a risk, right? That's again defined well in ISO Guide 73, which can include purchasing insurance. So if you have purchased insurance, for example, if something goes wrong, insurance will pay you, right? Sharing with another party the burden of loss. Or managing the whole management of risk, you outsource to another organization, right? Implementing service contracts with providers, revising deployment models. So this is basically transfer, right? Oh, really? You know what that sounds like? You simply say, not my problem. You will give the management to someone else. Or, you know, try and share another party with another party the burden of loss. Now, this may not apply for everything. Purchasing insurance, you can't buy insurance for everything, but many things you can. Risk control strategy. The third is reduce, as we say, risk reduction, action taken to um, lessen the probability or negative consequences, or both. This is associated with this guide, right? Associated with this guide. Now you have preparation should include an incident response plan, disaster recovery plan, business continuity plan. So if this happens, how do we respond? That is incident response, and we'll see in one of the lecture. And fortunately, you guys have a level 7 incident response course, the whole course itself. In this course, we'll try and touch important aspects. I'll try and introduce you what is incident response, incident handling is in general. But we have a course called incident response. It's level 7 course. Some of you, if you are interested, you will obviously take it, right? A disaster recovery plan. If a disaster happens, how will you recover? And if in unwanted situation, if something happens, how do we continue business? So you have this summaries of mitigation plans. For example, in incident response, action an organization takes during incidents or attacks, what you're going to do, list of steps taken, intelligence gathering, information analysis, when deployed, time frame, immediate, those kind of a particular plan to help reduce, right, risk reduction. Similarly, business committee plans, so organizations should have all these things. Risk control strategy. The last one is accept acceptance, decision to accept the risk. Again, you have ISO guidelines for this. ISO, International Standard Organization, I think, whatever it is, ISO, full form. Properly identifying and acknowledging risk and choosing not to control them. And this strategy is appropriate when the cost to protect an asset or asset exists, the cost to replace them, the cost to replace it or them, right? Or when the probability of risk is very low and the asset is of low priority based on qualitative analysis, right? We say low, high, medium, or even in quantitative. If you see, the cost is really high to maintain them, and you don't have, you simply accept, right? Otherwise, acceptance is basically negligence. If you have a logic behind, a rationale behind the reason behind the acceptance, it's fine. Or simply you neglect the risk and you will pay the price. Another risk control strategy is termination. Termination is basically removing or discontinuing the information asset from the organization. For example, if these hard disks in the computer are risky, if the network is too old, risky, there are legacy systems which we don't get support for, something this will, you simply replace it or terminate it. If you have money, you replace it, or you simply don't use it, right? Discontinuing a provided service, or if an employee is too risky, just fire them. So these are the sources you see, these are, and both are listed in the Hey guys, you there with me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I have to. Yeah, I didn't find that control which will help me close this,